So welcome everyone. I know we're at the last session of day one, but we're going to try and keep it interesting for you. My name is Dr. Belinda Townsend. I'm a research fellow here at the Australian National University in the School of Regulation and Global Governance. And I'm really honoured to be joined by my colleagues both online and here today to discuss Australian support for access to pandemic medicines. I want to start by acknowledging and celebrating the first Australians on whose lands we're meeting on today, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So as I mentioned, our panel is titled Australian Support for Access to Pandemic Medicines. And what we're going to do today is outline and critique Australia's role in the COVID-19 response in terms of supporting countries in our region to access diagnostics, vaccines and treatments. And we're going to be providing an analysis of our COVAX commitments, vaccine nationalism, vaccine donations, and Australia's approach to proposed international intellectual property waivers. We've got three fantastic experts, two of which are online. One of them is Dr. Sun Kim, who is Director of the Research Centre on Global Solidarity at the People's Health Institute in Korea. And we also have with us online Associate Professor Deborah Gleeson, who's unfortunately been caught up in a COVID situation in her family, so had to cancel her flights, but we're really glad that she could join us online. And I've also got with us Bridget Tenney, who is a Senior Technical Advisor for the Nossal Institute for Global Health at the University of Melbourne and a PhD student at La Trobe University. So the way we're going to work is we're going to have three presentations from Sun, Kim, Brigitte and Deb, and then open it up for discussion. So I'll start by giving you a bit of background to Sun Kim. As I mentioned, she's Director of the Research Centre on Global Solidarity at the People's Health Institute, which is a progressive non-profit research institute based in Seoul, South Korea. Sun is a researcher activist. She has researched vulnerability and healthcare and access to medicines and pharmaceutical production from a political economy of health perspective. She has also previously served as Southeast Asia and Pacific Region Coordinator of the People's Health Movement and now serves as the People's Health Movement Korea Country Coordinator. So welcome, Sun, and I'll hand over to you and hopefully we'll be able to hear you and have the slides up as well.
Thanks for the introduction, Belle. So very privileged and nice to meet you all. I'm gonna talk about the inequities in access to COVID vaccines from the global and regional perspective for about 20 minutes. This is the outline of my presentation. First, let me brief the global inequities in access to COVID vaccines. Then second, I would introduce to you which measures have been taken to deal with the inequities, namely COVAX, CTAP, and the TRIPS waiver, with reflection of the initial plans and final results of each. And third, let us remind of what are the drivers of the inequities. I would use the terms of vaccine apartheid and vaccine imperialism and vaccine capitalism, all of which have been frequently used to describe the global inequities in access to COVID vaccines, but with different nuances and implications. And fourth and last, I would discuss which measures deal with the root causes of the problems, and so what should be promoted for this and the next pandemic. First, global inequities and access to COVID vaccines. As of November 2022, 68.4% of the world population has received at least one dose of COVID vaccines, while in low-income countries, only 24.5% of the people have received at least one dose. And when you see the graph on the right of COVID vaccine boosters administered per 100 people, the inequity is intense. More intense. High-income countries have administered booster shots, while most people from low-income countries have not yet received their first doses. So how has this happened? While the production of COVID vaccines has been limited around the world, the fair distribution mechanism has been absent or not operated. And there have been several factors that contributed to the limitation of production, but the two main factors were key. One has been the monopoly of technologies and knowledge through intellectual property rights, and the other has been the inadequate and unequal use of global production capacity. And high-income countries have had priority access to vaccines and treatments to be developed in return for huge their public funding for the R&D. And the big pharma that received R&D support from the governments were based in the same high-income countries. The losers of the war have been forced to be low and middle-income countries that lacked purchasing power and technical skills. Which measures have been taken to prevent and deal with these problems? First, COVAX. COVAX was designed as a global solution to accelerate the development and manufacture of COVID-19 vaccines and guarantee rapid, fair, and equitable access to them for people in all countries. The initial aim was to have 2 billion doses available by the end of 2021, which should be enough to protect high-risk and vulnerable people, as well as frontline healthcare workers. But even from its design, there was a compromise to attract participation of high-income countries. So self-financing countries would be guaranteed doses depending upon how much they vote into it, up to 50% of their population. While funded countries subject to funding availability would receive doses up to 20% of their population in the longer term. And the funding for the funded countries, namely COVAX AMC, is entirely separate from the funding for the self-financing countries, namely COVAX facility, which means that the AMC is in no way cross-subsidized by the funded funds of the self-financing countries, and COVAX AMC would be funded mainly through ODA, as well as contributions from the private sector and philanthropy. So what is the result? This chart shows the COVID vaccine supply agreements by countries, and COVAX, which would cover at least more than 92 low and middle income countries, could not secure as many doses as European Commission. 1.85 billion doses shipped through COVAX to 146 countries as of November 23, 2022, and 0.19 billion doses to 59 self-financing countries, while 1.66 billion doses to 87 AMC funded countries. And this means that the COVAX has never achieved as its aim to deliver 2 billion doses by the end of 2021, as well as that most self-financing countries did not procure their vaccines through COVAX, while AMC countries, the funded countries, heavily depend on COVAX, which could not secure enough vaccines due to the hoardings by the high-income countries. Second, CTAP. CTAP was designed for the global community to voluntarily share knowledge, intellectual property rights, and data necessary for COVID. And this was to accelerate the development of products needed to fight COVID and the scale up of manufacturing and the removal of barriers to access in order to make products available globally. It was also to avoid the unnecessary duplication of efforts arising from the absence of such sharing. Holders of COVID health technology related knowledge, intellectual property, and/or data were invited to join the solidarity call to action. So what is the result? The chart on the right shows the countries that have informed WHO that they are joining the solidarity call to action. There are only 43 countries, mostly low and middle income countries, plus a few high income countries that are not home to the COVID vaccine developers. There is no single pharma company that has joined this call so far. And the chart on the left shows the list of countries that co-proposed the draft resolution to make CTAP at the World Health Assembly in 2020. And many high-income countries were part of this group, including Australia and South Korea, but did not join the CTAP call to action. And third and last, the TRIPS waiver. And Brigitte will talk about it in more detail in the next presentation, but let me introduce it briefly. The adoption of a waiver at the WTO level would suspend implementation, application, and enforcement of the relevant provisions of the TRIPS agreement in relation to prevention, containment, and treatment of COVID. This was proposed in the context that several manufacturers tried but failed to get licensing from the Big Pharma, and TRIPS flexibilities that were reaffirmed in the Doha Declaration were not enough. And TRIPS waiver would lead to rapid scaling up of manufacture worldwide, stimulation of innovation, enabling imports of the most affordable product options, and lowering cost of the products and removal of regulatory barriers. And this would lead to more equitable access to COVID vaccines. So what is the result? The 12th WTO Ministerial Conference decision on June 17th, 2022, after a year and 8 months from its proposal, allows patent rights only and excluded copyrights and trade secrets, and developing countries only. Further excluded developing countries with existing capacity to manufacture COVID vaccines, and vaccines only, excluded COVID treatments and diagnostics. Meaning it is difficult to use in practice, hard to contribute to the additional production of COVID vaccines. As a result, high-income countries back to normal, leaving low and middle-income countries behind. And let us dig in more detail regarding what are the drivers of the inequities. First, we call it as vaccine apartheid. High-income countries repeatedly said vaccines or vaccination should be global public goods and self-praised on their pledging to the COVAX. But what they have been really doing are vaccine hoarding competitions in the form of bilateral advanced purchasing agreements, neglecting CTAP and opposing the TRIPS waiver proposal and wasting time without sharing technologies and knowledge. And the results, what we have been experiencing are global vaccine shortages resulting in COVAX doses shortages, as well as a supplier-dominant chaotic market. Rivalry among high-income countries imposing export bans on domestically produced raw materials or final products of vaccines, and low and middle-income countries lagging behind with being dependent on the mercy of COVAX or from China or Russia. Second, we call it as vaccine imperialism. Low and middle income countries have manufacturing capacities that could be utilized and scaled up, but high income countries didn't allow them to do so, blocking sharing of technologies and knowledge. And the core arguments of high income countries and high income countries based Big Pharma were low and middle income countries don't have quality manufacturing capacities. IP rights suspension would allow China or India to steal their high-tech technologies, and IP rights protection is the key to innovation. But what has really led the development of COVID vaccines? It was public funding and public research, not IP rights protection. There are already research papers which calculated who funded research behind the COVID vaccines. And in the case of Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, 97% of R&D was funded by the public, and then the resulting vaccine was privatized to Big Pharma. And this chart shows that IP rights protection is the key hurdle for the alternative manufacturers based in low and middle income countries to scale up global production. Third and finally, we call it as vaccine capitalism. Let us reflect on the case of booster shot. It was Pfizer and Moderna who first raised the need for booster shots in April 2021. And high-income countries, which started vaccination first, announced plans for booster shots in September 2021, despite the WHO's call for a moratorium on booster shots until 2022. Then Pfizer and Moderna raised the vaccines price. And how about the lack of transparency in vaccines market? Even high-income countries was forced to keep the confidentiality of the amount and delivery schedule of production and supply, as well as the price, manufacturing cost, and profit margins of COVID vaccines, despite shortages and delays amid global purchase competition. Further, it was a system failure that we double paid to Big Pharma with public R&D support as well as with purchase guarantee. And not only bilateral advanced purchase agreements, but also COVAX had to do so. A US CSO Public Citizen published a report titled Pfizer's Power, analyzing leaked different confidential agreements that several high and upper middle income countries have made with Pfizer. The results show that Pfizer reserves the right to silence governments, Pfizer controls the donations, Pfizer secured an IP waiver for itself. Private arbitrators, not public courts, decide disputes in secret. Pfizer can go after state assets. Pfizer calls the shots on key decisions. And lastly, let us think about which measures deal with the root causes, what should be promoted for this and the next pandemic. So why COVAX has failed? While high-income countries were seeking bilateral advance purchase agreements, COVAX finances Big Pharma in return for supply of only limited doses for identified low and middle-income countries. COVAX is inefficient and costlier because of IPR costs when most of the funding is already from public money. And COVAX strengthens existing IP regime, undermines efforts at alternatives or improvements. In result, COVAX does not ensure enough doses. COVAX does not enable transfer of technology and for rapid scale-up of manufacture. And COVAX is not transparent in agreements with other countries. And this was the result of its governance structure. CEPI and Gavi, the global health PPPs, predominantly funded by Gates Foundation, dominate the COVAX and marginalize WHO. Even though the COVAX is predominantly funded by governments. COVAX coordination meeting, CCM, is co-chaired by CEPI and Gavi, and no decision can be taken that would contradict a decision by the respective boards of CEPI and Gavi, while WHO member states, especially from the low and middle income countries, lack decision-making role. And industry reps are called as partners, while civil society reps have limitations to meaningful engagement. And this is the reason why we insist the TRIPS waiver. It is the right to vaccines, right to production, right to technologies and knowledge, and eventually right to development. And not only for this COVID pandemic, if we make it properly, this would enable more equitable access to vaccines for the next pandemic. And this is the reason why we insist that the current TRIPS waiver, despite inadequate and insufficient, be extended to treatments and diagnostics beyond vaccines. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sun. You've done a brilliant job at outlining a lot of the structural problems that have created inequities in access to COVID-19 vaccines. And I'm sure that we have clarification questions. Please sort of jot them down and we'll come to them at the end. I next have Bridget Tenney. So Bridget is a public health practitioner who has a focus and expertise in gender, sexual and reproductive health, HIV and access to medicines. She's currently a PhD candidate at La Trobe University, and her research aims to quantify the impact of trade agreements on access to medicines in Thailand and Cambodia, and to explore the factors that influence decision-making in relation to intellectual property, trade policy, and access to medicines.
Thank you. I hope you can all hear me. Thanks to the organisers for including this session today. I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to any other First Nations people here today or online. So I'm going to talk you through a bit more about Australia's aid response in terms to COVID vaccine, but building on some of the information and background that Sun just provided. So hopefully I can use this. Yeah, great. Okay, so here's a slide of the total COVID vaccine doses administered per 100 people, and this is the latest statistic from October 25. So as you can see, Australia there in the red, we've currently, or as of October, administered about almost 2.5 doses per person in Australia. However, Australia's been involved in our own vaccine nationalism. We've purchased almost 10.8 doses per person in Australia, but only administered 2.5 of those. Australia has engaged quite a bit in vaccine donations, both in terms of doses and finance and money. And this is very much a charitable model. So as you can see there, we've donated over 51 million doses of vaccines. Our bilateral commitments, there's 60 million doses to be shared with the Asia Pacific, 523 million for the Regional Vaccine Access and Health Security Initiative, and 100 million contribution to the Quad Vaccine Partnership. And the Quad is that loose grouping of Australia, India, Japan, and the United States. They met in March 2021 and 100 billion investment from the Bank of Japan to finance this vaccine partnership. They aim to donate 1.2 billion doses of COVID vaccines to the Indo-Pacific by the end of 2022. So under this particular partnership, India would produce the vaccine doses, the United States would finance dose production, and Australia and Japan would aid in the vaccine manufacturing, distribution, and financing efforts. However, it's delivered less than half of these pledged doses. It's also been criticised beyond the humanitarian motives that it was a thinly veiled counter to China's vaccine diplomacy. Donations in terms of those promised to COVAX, as Sun outlined, COVAX, 130 million to COVAX in advanced market commitments, and an additional 85 million pledged in the May 2020 budget. However, no doses yet have been donated or actually delivered through COVAX. Okay, so this is where our doses have gone in terms of globally. We've had the top recipient countries being Vietnam with 26 million doses, over 26 million doses received, Indonesia at over 8 million, the Philippines at over 7 million, and Cambodia at 2.8 million. So keeping in mind, vaccine expiry needs to be at least 6 months for countries to be able to distribute the vaccines in a timely manner. And Australia should really be also considering health system strengthening, building to address the problems with supply chains and vaccine distribution channels. So in order to, I'm just sort of taking a step back here a little bit to unpack some of the entrenched barriers, structural barriers to vaccine access and to medicines access around the world. And to do that, it means exploring some of the systems that are set up, and one of those systems being the R&D model, the research and development model that rewards pharmaceutical companies with intellectual property rights to protect to award them a patent, essentially a monopoly for their product. So what are the rules then governing the granting of patents? So in order to do that, we need to go back. Some of you be very familiar with this, some of you less so. So in order to do this, we need to look at the World Trade Organization, which is the only global international organization dealing with the rules of trade between nations. It was established in 1995, but its predecessor, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, provided the rules for this system prior to that, and that had been in operation since 1948. So Australia has been a member since the inception of WTO in 1995. Okay, so WTO, the largest round, the GATT round, the largest and longest GATT round was the Uruguay round, which lasted from 1986 to 1994 and led to the creation of the WTO. And although the GATT had mainly dealt with the trade in goods, the WTO is broader and now covers trade in services and inventions, creations, designs, otherwise known as intellectual property. So the WTO sets rules that its member countries must obey, and these include minimum protection for intellectual property. And these are enshrined in what's known as the Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, or TRIPS, as you heard Sun referred to. So TRIPS also has some safeguards that can be used to protect public health. So one of those safeguards is the least developed country waiver or transition period, where least developed countries have until 2033 to apply the TRIPS provisions for pharmaceutical patents. Developing countries also, who weren't least developed countries, also had a transition period. They didn't have to apply the TRIPS agreement in terms of pharmaceuticals until January 1st, 2000. So this applied to countries such as India. But least developed countries at the moment still do not have to, who are WTO members, still do not have to apply the TRIPS agreement for pharmaceutical patents. So they don't have to grant patents for drugs. They're legally allowed to manufacture a product that may be patented in other countries. So this transition period has been extended twice, most recently in 2015. And least developed countries are those as recognised by the United Nations, and there's currently 47 least developed countries, and 36 of those are members of the World Trade Organization. So for instance, Cambodia is a least developed country and a member of the World Trade Organization. So as a least developed country, they don't currently have to grant patents for pharmaceuticals. Okay, another safeguard or flexibilities, as they're sometimes called, is the use of compulsory license. So a compulsory license is when a member country, a WTO member country, authorises use by a third party. So they're allowed to import or produce a patented product without the authorisation of the patent owner. So unlike what some countries were pushing for in these particular negotiations, the grounds on which this can be done are not limited by the agreement, but there are a certain amount of procedural procedures to follow to protect the legitimate interests of the patent owner. But that is currently a safeguard afforded to any WTO member. So the Doha Declaration of 2001 reaffirmed countries' rights to use the flexibilities enshrined within the TRIPS agreement in circumventing patent rights for better access to essential medicines. There was quite a bit of concern, especially amongst developing countries, that the implementation of TRIPS would compromise their ability to protect public health and to be able to provide medicines for their citizens. So it was designed to respond to these concerns about possible implications for access to medicines, and it specifically recognised that patents and prices can be an obstacle to accessing medicines. So this then comes back to the TRIPS waiver that Sun mentioned as well. So South Africa and India submitted this proposal in October 2020 to waive all IP, not just patents. There's a multitude of other IP that is intellectual property that is applicable to certain medical products, but they propose to waive all IP under TRIPS for all COVID products. So not just vaccines, that would include diagnostics and treatments, etc. So over 100 of the 164 WTO member countries supported this, but it was faced really stiff opposition from high-income countries such as those in the EU, UK, Switzerland, Germany, and Japan. So in a surprising but somewhat welcome development, many people never thought they'd see the day, but the American Biden administration expressed support for this TRIPS waiver, but only in terms of vaccine products. And that was in May 2021. Australia was fairly ambiguous about their support, but was a late supporter of the waiver after the US showed support for a waiver for vaccines. So there was so much negotiation and it took so long to come to a decision around this TRIPS waiver, 20 months in fact, and there was a decision only in June 2022 around this particular issue. And in that time, 5 million people had died from the pandemic. So although the original proposal was compromised to the extent that it was largely unworkable and failed to include the breadth of IP rights originally proposed. So it provides very little extra benefit than what the existing TRIPS flexibilities already offers WTO member countries and doesn't apply to all countries. So activists and supporters of the original text said it would do very little to increase access and vaccines to those most in need. So it would allow, it only waives one article, Article 31F, which would make it easier for vaccines made using these provisions to export it from one country of manufacture to a second developing country. But developing countries with existing capacity to manufacture COVID-19 vaccines were ironically encouraged to make binding commitments to opt out of this. It's procedurally onerous to do this as well. You have to do it product by product. And it's limited for the first 6 months and to patents only and not to other IP. Trade secrets is a very important IP barrier, especially to vaccines, and it doesn't apply to those. So many saw it as quite disappointing, and as far as we know, no country has actually used it yet to acquire vaccines in almost 6 months. So then that was the decision around diagnostics and treatments. That was just vaccines. The decision around diagnostic and treatments was due to be handed down 6 months later. So that's due in December 17th. There's been very little progress or consensus on what that will look like. And it's unlikely that they will get a decision in time. So there's a few groups who have different ideas around what that should look like. South Africa and India want to extend the TRIPS waiver decision the way it is, avoiding any new wording or definitions. Another group, including EU, Switzerland, Japan and UK, wants to see evidence of real life intellectual property barriers before even considering extending the agreement to therapeutics and diagnostics. And lastly, those countries such as Colombia, Mexico and China who want to have a definition or a list of products that would be covered by this extension. So that's where the TRIPS waiver is at the moment. And when you think about this is for pretty much the large majority of people in the world haven't lived through a pandemic before. And you think if it doesn't take a pandemic to get agreement on these sort of things, what does it take? So it was very, very disappointing. I'm going to hand over to Deb now, who will discuss other options to addressing some of these real structural barriers that lead to inequities in access to medicines and in particular vaccines. Thanks, Deb.
Thanks very much, Bridget and Sun Kim, for your excellent presentations. I'll just pop mine up onto the screen. Okay, I hope that people can see my my main slide there.
Yep, we can see.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I'm an associate professor in public health in the Department of Public Health at La Trobe University, and also am a member of the Public Health Association of Australia and play a role in PHAA's advocacy around healthy trade agreements. And before I start the presentation, I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land, where I'm sitting at the moment is the Wurundjeri people, and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. So I'm going to start off with just a bit of a stock take. So we've heard a really dire picture painted by Sun Kim of what's happened over the last few years in terms of inequities in access to COVID-19 products. And then Bridget's painted a picture for us about what Australia's been doing to date in terms of vaccine donations and also in terms of moving quite late, but moving to support the TRIPS waiver proposal that was made at the World Trade Organization. So where are we now? So we're in a situation where, we're past the, the worst of the emergency stage of the pandemic, but we've still got widespread COVID-19 transmission. We're expecting more variants. We've got hundreds of subvariants of Omicron circulating at the moment, but we could also see the emergence of more severe or more transmissible variants that could prolong the pandemic and prolong countries' recovery from the pandemic. We're also still seeing persistent inequities in access to COVID-19 products. So although almost 13 billion COVID-19 vaccine doses have been administered around the world, we're still in a situation where less than 25% of people in low-income countries have received a dose. So it's not a problem that we've solved yet. We've come a long way, but we've still got a very large proportion of the world's population that hasn't received a dose of vaccine yet. And recently we've seen a shift from the really critical vaccine supply shortages that we saw earlier in the pandemic and through to the end of 2021 to a set of more complex issues around the lack of coordination, of timing, of deliveries, delivery of vaccine doses with short expiries, lack of health system capacity to actually roll out vaccines, and some vaccine hesitancy in some countries in particular. So these are not necessarily replacing the issues that we saw earlier, but also part of the legacy of the issues. So as Sun Kim outlined for us, COVAX was very late to deliver doses to a lot of countries. We saw less than 1 billion of the 2 billion doses that had been promised by the end of 2021 delivered by that time, and we still haven't got to that 2 billion figure yet. And by the end of 2021, so more than a year after vaccines had first been rolled out anywhere in the world, only 8.5% of people in low-income countries had received a dose. So now we've got more vaccine available, there's more flowing through COVAX, but a lot of it's been really lumpy. So it's come in large batches, tens of millions of doses at a time that have arrived in countries often with little notice, often close to expiry, and there's been a lack of attention to giving countries the support that they need with actually getting that vaccine into arms. And that's partly a legacy of the issues that Sun Kim was talking about earlier on around lack of involvement of low and middle income countries in the governance and design of COVAX, so that a lot of those issues weren't considered in the early stages of COVAX's planning. It was all about getting the vaccine made and getting those deliveries without thinking about what would happen at the other end. So as well as vaccines, we've had a lot of severe inequities in access to tests. So by March 2022, 3 billion tests had been administered around the world, but only 0.4 of those in low-income countries. And we're seeing the same sorts of inequities in access to treatments for COVID-19 as well, particularly the antivirals that have fairly recently become available. So the antivirals that are particularly important are those made by Pfizer, Paxlovid, and by Merck Sharp and Dohme. That's the Lagevrio antiviral. And while Pfizer and Merck Sharp and Dohme have both entered into agreements with the medicines patent pool to enable generic companies to make cheaper alternatives to those medications, they'll only be able to be supplied to certain low and middle income countries, particularly at the lower end of the scale. So a lot of upper and middle income countries won't be able to access those cheaper versions and will be in a very difficult position, being unable to access the cheaper generics, but also unable to pay the high prices set by the originator companies, which are hundreds of dollars for US dollars for a 5-day course of treatment. So beyond COVID-19, we're also seeing the same sorts of inequities around other products as well. So monkeypox is a good example. It's just been renamed as Mpox by the World Health Organization. We're seeing the same sorts of bottlenecks, supply shortages, hoarding by wealthy countries, and a lack of sort of thinking about how to get these really life-saving products to the countries that need them the most. And we're likely to see these same dynamics playing out in future pandemics unless we deal with some of these underlying root causes that Sun Kim was talking about. So, you know, the monopolies that pharmaceutical companies can have over these products, preventing other companies from making them, the hoarding that we've seen by wealthy countries and sort of drip feeding of excess supplies to low-income countries, these same sorts of things are likely to play out unless we get to some of these root causes. So I want to focus for the rest of the presentation on what can Australia do at this stage to advance equitable access to pandemic response products. And this is based on a paper that Belinda and Brigitte and I published in the Australian and New Zealand Journal of Public Health around the middle of this year, where we argued that Australia can do 4 things: provide, redistribute and fund products for low-income countries and other countries in our region, support international initiatives to waive intellectual property rights, invest in building production capacity in low and middle income countries, and also impose conditions on the public funding for research and development for pandemic response products. And I'll add a 5th one today that we didn't cover in our paper, about a parliamentary inquiry into Australia's response and what we've done so far to help other countries and what more we could do. So first of all, there's more that we could do in terms of actually helping at a very practical level to provide, redistribute and fund products for low-income countries, particularly in our region. So as Brigitte pointed out before, we ordered a lot more vaccine doses than Australia actually needs, and a lot of those doses could actually be redirected to other countries. It's important for those doses to go through COVAX so that they can actually get to the countries that need them the most, rather than just being given to countries that where the arrangements in our national interests. For future pandemics, we really need to think about planning for equitable distribution from the beginning, rather than just donating the excess doses that we don't need. And unfortunately, we've seen a lot of countries having to actually dispose of doses of vaccines because, this preparatory work hasn't been done early enough. They've ordered too many, they haven't been able to be redistributed in time. We also need to make sure that contracts with pharmaceutical companies actually provide the room for doses to be reallocated. While we don't know very much, if anything, about Australia's contracts with vaccine manufacturers, we do know that many of the vaccine manufacturers have actually included restrictive conditions in their contracts with other countries where they've been leaked or details have become available that have prevented that sort of sharing of doses. So that's something that we really need to make sure doesn't happen in future, and that we do have the room to be able to share products more equitably with other countries. And we can also explore whether there's potential for Australia to actually manufacture products under compulsory licence for exports to other countries, and put those arrangements in place well before the next pandemic so that we're able to help other countries in that way. But we really need to look beyond simply providing products to other countries, because as Sun Kim and Brigitte have both pointed out, a charitable approach won't actually solve some of these underlying issues, the concentration of research and development and manufacturing in the global north, and the fact that the global south is always getting the leftovers from these initiatives. So Australia can really help by supporting initiatives to waive intellectual property rights. And as Sun Kim and Bridget Tenney have pointed out, there's negotiations going on right now at the WTO to expand the TRIPS waiver to include treatments and tests. And this is really vital to make sure that countries can access these products and that we can really ramp up manufacturing and get it to the countries that need it. And although Brigitte pointed out that the TRIPS waiver that we have at the moment is quite limited in some ways, it's particularly important for treatments. There's a lot of patents on the COVID-19 treatments, and the trade secrets protection is not as important as the patents in terms of providing access to these treatments. So if we can get this TRIPS waiver expanded, there is a lot of scope to actually increase the production of COVID-19 antiviral treatments and to get them to the countries that are needing them. We can also provide assistance to developing countries to use the legal safeguards that they already have, whether that's the compulsory licensing provisions already available under the TRIPS agreement or the TRIPS waiver to actually enable them to produce these or import these pandemic products. So countries often, particularly low-income countries, often struggle to make sure that their domestic intellectual property laws allow compulsory licensing, and then to actually use and implement those compulsory licensing provisions. So this is an area where Australia can help to provide some support to enable them to use those legal safeguards. And another really promising initiative is the Pandemic Prevention, Preparedness and Response Accord that's being negotiated at the World Health Organization at the moment. So just a couple of weeks ago, there was a conceptual zero draft of the Pandemic Accord that was leaked that showed that there's some really promising proposals around increasing the transparency on the pharmaceutical industry side, around the procurement contracts, increasing the transparency of the funding of pharmaceutical research and development, proposals to place conditions on research and development funding to drive equitable access. So things like requiring companies to use open licensing rather than keep monopolies on the products if they're underpinned by public financing. Provisions around supporting technology transfer to low and middle income countries to ensure that they can make the products, and also to relax intellectual property rights during future pandemics. It's taken such a long time to negotiate a very limited waiver for COVID-19 vaccines. It took more than 20 months. We can't let this happen in a future pandemic. We need to make sure that there is capacity to do this right from the beginning. So thirdly, Australia can also invest and support the building of production capacity in low and middle income countries. So one really important initiative is the mRNA Technology Transfer Hub, which the World Health Organization has set up in South Africa. And there's also a global biomanufacturing training hub in South Korea. So Australia can support and fund these initiatives and look for other regional initiatives to support and fund to actually increase that production capacity in the global south. Fourthly, Australia can impose conditions on the public funding of research and development for pandemic response products. So early on in the COVID-19 pandemic, vaccine R&D was funded by billions of dollars of public funding, and also through the advanced purchase agreements to buy the finished products. But despite this risk that was assumed by governments, there was very little in the way of conditions that were attached to require affordable pricing or sharing of intellectual property and know-how. And instead, the pharmaceutical companies actually placed a lot of conditions on the contracts themselves, restricting countries from sharing doses. They profited very handsomely from the agreements that they had with countries. Pfizer's net profit, for example, for 2021 was almost $22 billion. And they set high prices for some vaccines and products. So the Pfizer vaccine, for example, would cost around $30 per dose, and Pfizer is actually planning to increase this to between $110 and $130 per dose next year. And there was very little voluntary sharing of intellectual property and know-how by most of the pharmaceutical companies that made these products. And some of these companies actually even opposed initiatives to encourage the sharing of that know-how and technology. So Australia could certainly take some steps in terms of placing conditions on public funding for research and development that stipulate affordable pricing and open licensing of the IP and know-how. This would go a long way. And finally, I think it would be a very good idea for Australia to undertake a parliamentary inquiry examining Australia's pandemic response so far in terms of its contribution to the equitable access to COVID-19 products, and to develop some recommendations for how we should go forward in terms of both the COVID-19 pandemic and also future pandemics. So we've seen Australia undertake a number of reviews so far, most recently the review by Jane Holton into Australia's vaccine purchasing, but we haven't yet seen an examination of Australia's response in terms of helping other countries. And the Canadian Parliament has recently gone through such a process. The Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development did a report on Canada's response and made a number of really worthwhile recommendations around increasing the funding for vaccine equity initiatives, making R&D funding conditional on open licensing of the products, advocating for extending the TRIPS waiver to cover tests and treatments, and also reviewing Canada's compulsory licensing for export arrangements. So going forward, I think that would be a very worthwhile thing for the Australian Parliament to do, and to really consider how we can strengthen that response going forward. That brings me to the end of the presentation, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Deb. It's possible to have Sun Kim and Deb on the screen so you can see you. So we've got just under half an hour for Q&A and discussion, and we've got someone with a roving mic. Any comments, questions, reflections? Yeah.
Hi, my name's Alana. I'm from ANU. Forgive me, this isn't my area of expertise, so apologies if this is like a 101 kind of question, but I'm just fascinated. Why did governments do such a poor job in negotiating conditions when they were underpinning such a staggeringly large amount, by the sounds of it, of R&D?
Were you able to hear the question, Sun Kim? Yep.
Sun Kim, would you like to take that first?
So basically, as I shared in my presentation, it was the supplier dominant chaotic market. So every government, including high-income countries, just compete each other to secure priority access to the COVID products, including vaccines. So they did not put priority over the equitable or fair conditions regarding even for their own national population. So that might be the answer.
I think Deb can help me out with this one as well, but I believe AstraZeneca, actually, that was an Oxford University manufactured vaccine, and there was a push to make it open access and jump in anytime, Deb, and patent free, and they were convinced at the last minute by Bill and Melinda Gates to make it a to patent the product and make it a patented product. So I think time was of the essence as well to put out grants to get vaccines as quick as possible. And I don't think there's a great precedent for it, to be honest, as well. So maybe that needs to be something that needs to be considered, a brave government to put in a precedent around these conditions on public funding.
I think one of the factors was the enormous power that the pharmaceutical industry holds in this space. So governments were very reliant on private industry in terms of producing vaccines at the at that sort of commercial level. And I don't think there was a lot of forethought that went into, you know, thinking about what would happen after the development of them. And the industry really holds the power in those negotiations, and that kind of, you know, that has a long history in terms of the industry wielding a lot of power, particularly in the US and the EU, where it does make an enormous economic contribution, and the industry also engages in a lot of lobbying and has, you know, makes a lot of political donations and has very close relationships with government. So a very powerful industry holding a lot of, you know, technical knowledge and also the sort of facilities and personnel to be able to scale up production of a vaccine really quickly. I think, you know, some governments probably felt that like they were over a barrel in terms of not being able to set conditions on that funding. But, you know, I think that the whole sort of, you know, political economy around this was sort of set up for this to happen, and it will happen again unless we really rethink how we approach all of these things and do it differently next time.
Yeah. My question was part of like kind of covered there, but then I just want to make sure, like I was checked about the distribution data of the Australian vaccine to other countries. Bridget kind of showed that in the presentation as well. Like our donation has been bilateral instead of multilateral. We promised we're gonna give 1 million COVAX and we didn't provide. And in terms of the bilateral allocation, I think the majority was given to Vietnam and Indonesia a lot as well. Like how is the decision being made? I wonder if there's any transparency from the Australian government, or have you ever got a chance to look into this negotiation and allocation process of vaccine that Australian government bases decision on? Yeah.
On how we would distribute vaccines to other countries?
Criteria, like how we make the decision, how we decide which country we give more to.
Yeah, I think we did prioritize countries in the region as well. And to be honest, I'm not sure, but there was a certain amount of existing relationships, aid relationships with countries in the region, Southeast Asia and the Pacific in particular. And also we did have a lot of AstraZeneca in particular that we didn't use. So that was available for donation, and countries who wanted to take AstraZeneca, because there were some countries who perhaps were not wanting to take AstraZeneca at that stage. So I don't know, maybe Deb or Sun might be more familiar with how we made those decisions, and maybe they weren't so transparent. I'm not sure.
Thanks, Bridget. I think there's been very little transparency on the part of the Australian government around any of this. So while it's possible to, you know, to get those figures about how many doses have been given to which countries, we really don't have any, you know, insight other than that into how decisions have been made. A lot of those doses have been, the overwhelming majority of those doses have been delivered this year. So Australia really kind of joined other countries in terms of, you know, vaccinating our own population first and then turning our attention to other countries after that.
Thanks a lot for these really good presentations. I'm Susan Sal from RegNet. And I'm really curious, I'd love to hear from each of you what you think the prospect, you know, given all the structural barriers, what do you think the prospects are for the pandemic treaty? And, you know, what are your hope, you know, the hopeful scenario, and what kind of strategies might get it over the line? And what the biggest obstacles you see to having that come to fruition?
Bridget, would you like to go?
I think we've got to hope. I think we've got to hope because it's a it does go to the clear structural barriers and inequities if that draft that got leaked was anything to go by. So I think if we really want to avoid a repeat of what we've seen with this pandemic in terms of inequities, you really got to get to those drivers of the inequities. And I think that if it does include things that we've seen so far, then we've got to hope that that could get up. I think the same barriers that apply to the TRIPS waiver will be applying to this. The same countries, perhaps with you know, vested interest from pharmaceutical companies who Deb said are very powerful, big lobbyists, donate a lot of money, make a lot of money, contribute a lot in terms of GDP to their respective countries. I think it's you know, difficult to challenge the status quo in terms of that. So I think it's bound to be really difficult, and I think the challenges will be the same, but I think we have to hope that this might be a way forward when we've seen the outcome of not doing anything about it, not challenging some of these structural drivers in this particular pandemic. And excuse me, hopefully not COVID, I did do a rat test. If we don't do this the same, you know, history will repeat itself. So I'm hopeful there's other treaties that have got up quite quickly that you wouldn't have thought so, like the tobacco treaty. So there's precedent for really fighting a powerful enemy, if you like, if you want to put it in those terms. You know, tobacco companies are probably at one stage wielded a similar sort of power as pharmaceutical companies. So if that can happen, I hold hope that maybe there might be something that can be achieved with a pandemic treaty.
Deb or Sun Kim, would you like to?
I actually honestly don't have that much enthusiasm toward the pandemic treaty, as you know. Of course, we do have the precedence of the tobacco treaty, but still we have some limitation of that treaty even. And when we see the older process of the COP governance structure and all the disputes around who should pay, who would pay, and who would be benefited from. And considering that difficulties around the global equitable governance structure, we should fight for the positive prospect much. For example, as Deb shared at the last of the presentation, the national inquiry is a very much important idea, I think. After 3 years of this pandemic, we are now, I think, somewhat forgetting about all the severe, intense inequities we have experienced. No, so we should reflecting about the severity and what the inhumanity of the global inequities of the COVID products at the national level, for example, inquiry, and at the global level, like there is a trial and efforts by the People's Health Movement to make the People's Tribunal be reality at the global level, to reflect and point out why should be who should be blamed and why should be the next step. That kind of struggle, political struggles, only to make the status quo be improved, not the informal, not the formal official process like the pandemic treaty process.
I agree with everything that Brigitte and Sun Kim have said. I think that one thing that's encouraging to me is that the WHO pandemic treaty is being negotiated in a health space rather than a trade space. So I think that that means there is room for inclusion of, of more of the public health argument, at least initially. And I think that's probably why the conceptual draft has been so promising in terms of, coming out of those sort of early discussions in the health dominated space. I think that as the negotiations progress, and particularly once we get to actual text-based discussions, because the conceptual draft, I think, is more in the realm of ideas rather than the actual text that will be, shaped in terms of ending up in the final treaty. I think that Big Pharma is already ramping up its opposition. It's already saying this won't work. And I think we'll see that same sort of opposition from the pharmaceutical industry and from the countries that have argued against the TRIPS waiver and against other initiatives as well. In terms of what might get it over the line, I think civil society input and monitoring will be really important, and the inclusion of civil society voices in that debate in a way that they haven't been included in some of the other debates and spaces. So in COVAX and the ACT accelerator, we saw civil society very excluded from the beginning. Civil society doesn't have much of a voice at the WTO, but I think hopefully that will be different at the WHO. And I think a lot will depend on what type of legal instrument is chosen for the pandemic treaty. So whether WHO goes down the path of a binding treaty, or whether it becomes something else that's more sort of aspirational rather than binding. But definitely there's a lot of promise there at the moment. So we'll see what happens in that space.
Deb, I was wondering, just on that point about civil society monitoring, if you might want to offer some comments about what the Public Health Association of Australia has done as a peak NGO. Just people in the room might be from the NGO world and thinking about how they might be able to support.
Thanks, Belinda. So the Public Health Association of Australia has been involved in an informal network that's been doing some advocacy around global vaccine equity. So some of the other organisations in that network include Amnesty International, Oxfam, Médecins Sans Frontières, and the Australian Fair Trade and Investment Network. So that network's been involved in writing letters to ministers. There was just some visits to Parliament a couple of weeks ago. Various sort of submissions and information briefs, events, and so on. Back in 2020, when India and South Africa first put their TRIPS waiver proposal to the World Trade Organization, we organised a letter that was signed by hundreds of health professionals to the then Prime Minister, urging the Australian government to support the waiver, and we've sort of continued on with various initiatives along those lines as well. And I think when Brigitte mentioned before that the Australian government changed its position in 2021 on the waiver, and I think that was largely due to the efforts of that group in really sort of applying some pressure to the government on that issue, along with, of course, the fact that the US had also moved to support it.
Any other comments, questions? Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. My name is Pam Rakla, and I'm just interested in the role of the public, because I've noticed that in terms of public opinion around vaccine equity, it hasn't really resonated so much in public discussions. I'm just curious to know why that might be the case, and if there's something that different sectors could do to promote that engagement.
Bridget, did you want to?
Sure. I think at the start, there was so much, our vaccine rollout in Australia was slow. And I think there was quite a lot of self-interest from the government and Australians at the time, like, where's our vaccine? Other countries have got it. We need it now. We haven't ordered enough. We haven't ordered enough Pfizer. So I think there was a lot of self-interest at the time from Australians, and a lot of concern that we weren't protecting ourselves. And I think that, the government's always going to respond to its voting constituents. So I think that was the priority at the time, was to speed up the purchasing and the distribution of vaccines to its own population. And I think, to be honest, people were probably, just my own opinion, probably a little bit disinterested about what's going on in other countries. They were more interested in getting a vaccine in their own arm. But there probably hasn't been a huge amount of, media coverage or that either. And I don't know why that is. And that's unfortunate that we are still in this self-interested space. But maybe now that we are, some people have even had 4th doses in Australia, we can take the time to sit back and reflect on where other countries are at the moment, and consider engaging with the new government at the moment to see if they can, look at the aid program to be a little bit more concerned about what's going on then in terms of vaccine and COVID products inequities, and indeed any sort of medicine inequities in our neighbouring countries, or those that we seek to engage with in terms of the aid program.
Sun Kim or Deb, did you want to comment on the framing of vaccine equity?
If I can share the South Korean case, I think one of the critical factors that frame the public opinion regarding the equities of access to vaccines was the political leaders framing, manipulating the public opinion. Like, for example, in South Korea, during the early phase of the pandemic, the Korean government, the president and the Minister of Foreign Affairs declared that they would not support the vaccinationalism. They would only secure the vaccines only through COVAX, not through the bilateral agreements. But after huge attacks, political attacks from the opposing party, which was conservative ones, they could not keep their decision and had to change their decision to secure vaccines through bilateral agreements, as the frame that the political opposing party utilized was the vaccine procuring failure by the government, not the efforts by the government to ensure globally equitable vaccines, but the failure to secure vaccines for their own national population. And so not the people, but the political leaders was the one of the critical factors that framed the negative opinion toward more equitable distribution regarding COVID vaccines. And plus, maybe so that is the reason why the civil society and the researchers' discourses, theories, and campaigns are critical to frame the discourses to be more public oriented one.
Thanks, Sun Kim. I think that one of the really difficult messages to get across to the public is that donations won't solve the problem. I think, a lot of people do worry about the sort of really stark inequities that we're seeing, and that, you know, that are quite easy to show in the way that Sun Kim did at the start of her presentation, with those graphs that show that massive gap between the vaccination rates between low income and high income countries. But I think, you know, where people go first is, well, we need to give more. And because the Australian government did commit, you know, quite a large number of donated doses quite early on, I think a lot of people probably felt like, you know, we were doing what we could. What's much harder to get across is those root causes of the problem, and what countries can actually do on the international stage that will make a difference on those issues. And I think people sometimes feel just too overwhelmed with the size of the problem and how technically complex and intractable it is. And, you know, it is a difficult situation, and a single country acting alone can't change the system. So I think, you know, these are things that we have to keep whittling away at, and making sure that we are, you know, educating, you know, politicians, bureaucrats, the media, the public, to understand these issues, and to keep putting pressure on politicians and political parties to actually to move forward on these issues. And it's not just, you know, it's not just a matter of what Australian politicians and the Australian government thinks either. It's what the Australian government is saying to its counterparts in other countries, and moving that global debate forward as well.
All right, I think we're sort of wrapping up now, so I just want to ask you to please join me in thanking our speakers again for those fantastic discussion. If you are interested in the piece that we published in the Australian New Zealand Journal of Public Health, please come get in touch and we can send it to you. Or if you want to hear more about what the Public Health Association of Australia or the People's Health Movement in the region is doing, we can share that information as well. So thank you.
Thanks.